So this story isn't something that happened to me directly. It happened to a work friend of mine, Anna. We're not super close, but we'd grab lunch sometimes, you know? After everything went down, she moved away, and we mostly lost touch. But she told me the whole thing right after it happened, when she was still staying at her sister's place and just trying to process it all. I feel like I need to tell it. It's one of those things that just sticks with you. Okay, so Anna had just gotten her own place. It was a big deal for her. She was 24, working her first real office job, and she'd finally saved up enough to get out of a noisy shared house with 3 other girls. This new apartment was her sanctuary. It was on the 3rd floor of an older, but well-kept brick building in a pretty quiet part of the city. Not downtown, but a neighborhood with lots of trees and little family-owned bakeries. Her apartment itself wasn't big, just a 1-bedroom, but it was all hers. She was so proud of it. She spent the first month painting the walls a soft gray, putting up shelves, and buying a comfy couch. She was a very neat person, almost obsessively so. Everything had its place. Her life was like that too, I guess. Very structured. Wake up at 6:30, gym, work, home, cook a healthy dinner, watch a show on Netflix, read a chapter of a book, and be in bed by 10:30. Every single day. To some people that might sound boring, but for her, that routine was safety. It was control. That little 3rd-floor apartment was her fortress against the world. She told me she loved the feeling of locking her door at night, knowing she was completely alone and completely safe. The day it all started was a Tuesday in October. One of those miserable, rainy days where it's not quite cold enough for a heavy coat, but the dampness gets into your bones anyway. She was walking home from the bus stop, head down under her umbrella, just wanting to get back to her warm, dry apartment. Her street had these big, green public trash cans placed every block or so. And as she passed one, something caught her eye. Next to the overflowing bin, sitting on the wet pavement, was a box. It was a small wooden box, maybe the size of a shoebox for kids' shoes. What was weird, and what made her stop, was that it was bone dry. The rain was coming down pretty steadily, but this box looked like it had just been placed there from inside a warm house. It was a dark, polished wood, almost black, and the surfaces were covered in these intricate hand-carved floral patterns. It looked old. Genuinely old, not like a cheap knockoff from a home decor store. And on the lid, right in the center, was a small, rectangular piece of aged yellowed paper, stuck on with what looked like old glue. On it, in neat black ink cursive, were 2 words. Don't open. Now, Anna was not a risk-taker. She was the kind of person who reads the terms and conditions. She doesn't jaywalk. But there was something about the box. It was the contrast. You know? The beautiful, clean, dry object sitting right next to a pile of soggy garbage. The elegant handwriting. The blatant warning that felt more like a challenge. She stood there for a full minute, just staring at it. People were walking past her, their umbrellas bumping. But she didn't notice. A part of her brain, the logical part she relied on, was screaming at her to just walk away. It's trash for a reason. It could be anything. It's weird. But another part, a part she didn't even know she had, was completely captivated. She told me it felt like the box was meant for her, like it had been placed there specifically for her to find. It was a stupid, romantic notion, but she couldn't shake it. So after a quick look around to make sure no one was watching her, which is funny, looking back, she quickly bent down, scooped up the box, and tucked it under her arm, shielded by her umbrella. It was heavier than she expected, solid. She walked the rest of the way home with her heart beating a little faster than usual, a mix of excitement and a tiny, prickling sense of dread. Once inside her apartment, with the door locked and the chain on, she finally felt she could examine her prize. The feeling of safety washed over her, like always. This was her space. Nothing bad could happen here. She put the box down on her little kitchen counter. The dark wood, a stark contrast to the white quartz. It really was beautiful. The carvings were of vines and flowers she didn't recognize, and they were so detailed you could see the tiny veins on the leaves. There was no visible lock, no hinges, no seam where a lid should be. It seemed to be carved from a single block of wood, except for a very, very fine line running around the top third. She ran her nails along the line, trying to get some purchase to pry it open. Nothing. The seam was perfect, almost invisible. She tried to slide the top off. It wouldn't budge. She shook it. It was completely silent. No rattling, no sound at all. It felt like a solid block. Frustration started to replace her curiosity. What was the point of a box you couldn't open? She peeled at a corner of the paper note. It was stuck on tight, and she was afraid she'd rip it, so she stopped. For an hour, she tried everything she could think of. She tried slipping a thin knife into the seam. The blade wouldn't go in. She tried tapping it on the counter, hoping to jar the lid loose. It was pointless. In the end, defeated, she decided it was just a weird, unsolvable puzzle. So she wiped it down one more time, even though it was already clean, and placed it on her coffee table in the living room. It actually looked kinda cool there, like a mysterious artifact. An interesting conversation piece, she told herself. She went about her evening routine, made a quinoa salad, called her mom, put on a familiar sitcom. But she kept glancing over at the box. It sat there, silent and dark, absorbing the light from the TV. It felt present. It had a weight in the room that was more than just its physical mass. By 10:30, she was exhausted. She did her final safety check, window locks, patio door, and the double lock on the front door. She went to bed, the weirdness of the day already fading as she drifted off to sleep. Her apartment was silent, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. It was the normal, peaceful silence she cherished. She woke up suddenly. It wasn't a slow, groggy wake-up. It was instantaneous, like a switch had been flipped. 1 second she was dreaming. The next she was awake, her body tense. The room was pitch black. She looked at her alarm clock. The red numbers glowed. 2:03 a.m. She never woke up in the middle of the night. Never. She lay perfectly still, listening. What had woken her up? There was no sound now, just the familiar hum of the fridge. She was about to dismiss it, to roll over and go back to sleep, when she heard it. It was so quiet she wasn't sure she'd heard it at all at first. A tiny, rhythmic noise. Scritch, scritch, scratch. It was coming from the living room. It was an incredibly faint sound, a dry, whispery scratching. Her mind immediately tried to find a rational explanation. A mouse? No. The building was old but clean. She'd never seen any sign of pests. The wind rattling something? No. The sound was too deliberate, too organic. It had a pattern. Scritch, scratch, pause, scritch, scratch. Her heart started pounding, a heavy, dull thud against her ribs. She sat up in bed, straining her ears in the darkness. The sound was unmistakably coming from the direction of the coffee table. From the box. The image of the box, dark and silent, flashed in her mind. But it wasn't silent anymore. The sound was weak, fragile, like a small animal trapped inside something. Desperately, weakly, trying to claw its way out. An insect, maybe? A very large one? But she had shaken the box. It had been silent. She tried to tell herself she was dreaming, that this was just her overactive imagination playing tricks on her after finding the weird object. But the sound was persistent. It was real. She sat there, frozen in her bed, for what felt like an eternity, just listening. The sound was so small, so pathetic, yet in the absolute silence of her safe, secure apartment, it was the loudest, most terrifying thing she had ever heard. It was the sound of something alive, where nothing should be. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet from before. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, a watching silence. She didn't move. She just sat there, upright in her bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the dark doorway that led to her living room. She was listening. But she was no longer listening for a sound. She was listening to the emptiness, waiting. And for the first time since she had moved in, Anna did not feel safe in her own home. She stayed like that, sitting bolt upright in her bed, for God knows how long. She told me later it felt like hours, but it was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. Every muscle in her body was locked tight. She was just listening to the silence. And like she told me, it was a totally different kind of quiet now. Before, the silence of her apartment was a comfort, like a warm blanket. Now it was heavy. It felt like it was listening back. Eventually, the sheer physical need to move forced her to. Slowly, like an old woman, she swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet touched the cold floorboards, and she flinched. She didn't turn on a light. She just couldn't bring herself to do it. As if flipping a switch would somehow confirm that something was wrong. She crept to her bedroom doorway, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her teeth, and peered out into the living room. The only light came from the streetlights outside, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. And there it was, on the coffee table. The box. It was just a dark shape in the gloom, completely inert, exactly where she had left it. There was no sign of movement, no evidence that it had been the source of that tiny, horrifying sound. For a second, a wave of relief washed over her. It had to have been a dream, a stress-induced nightmare brought on by finding a weird object. That had to be it. Her rational mind clung to that explanation, like a drowning person to a piece of driftwood. But she didn't go back to bed. She couldn't. She spent the rest of the night on her couch, wrapped in a throw blanket, staring at the box until the gray morning light started to seep through the windows. She didn't sleep. The next day at work was a total blur. She felt hungover, even though she hadn't had a drop of alcohol. She kept zoning out in the middle of typing an email, her mind replaying that sound. Scritch, scratch, pause, scritch, scratch. It was so faint, yet it had imprinted itself on her brain. She made a couple of dumb mistakes in some spreadsheets, and her boss, a nice but very by-the-book guy named Mr. Henderson, actually called her into his office to ask if everything was okay. She just mumbled something about not sleeping well and he let it go, but she could feel his eyes on her for the rest of the afternoon. All day she wrestled with what to do. The logical part of her brain, the Anna who organized her spice rack alphabetically, was screaming at her to throw the box away. Just take it back to the trash can where she found it, and forget this ever happened. But another part of her couldn't. It was more than just curiosity now. It was a kind of stubborn need to know. She had to know if she was going crazy. She had to know if the sound would come back. So she made a decision. She was going to stay up and wait for it. That night felt different. The usual comfort she got from her evening routine was gone. Every normal activity was colored by this growing sense of dread. Cooking dinner, washing the dishes, watching TV, it all felt like she was just killing time, waiting for an appointment she desperately didn't want to keep. At 10:30, her usual bedtime, she made a pot of strong coffee instead. She turned off the television, leaving only a single small lamp on in the corner of the living room, casting a soft, yellow glow. The apartment was quiet. She sat on the couch, facing the coffee table, and waited. The hours crawled by. 11 o'clock, midnight, 1 o'clock. Nothing. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional swish of a car passing on the street 3 floors below. With every passing minute, she felt a little more foolish and a little more relieved. It was a dream. It had to be. Her eyelids were getting heavy, the caffeine fighting a losing battle against her exhaustion. She was just about to give up, to admit defeat and crawl into bed, when she glanced at her phone. 1:59 a.m. Her breath caught in her throat. She sat up straighter, her entire body suddenly alert. The silence in the room seemed to deepen, to become absolute. She stared at the box, her eyes burning from tiredness. The clock on her phone ticked over. 2 a.m. Scritch scratch. It was back. And this time, there was no doubt. She was wide awake. The sound was just as faint as the night before, but in the focused silence, it was as clear as a bell. It wasn't random either. She realized that now. It had a rhythm. It was a steady, deliberate beat. Scritch scrape. Scritch scrape. Scritch scrape. It was the sound of a tiny, sharp point being systematically dragged across the inner surface of the wood. It was methodical. It was patient. And it was coming, without any question, from inside the box. Anna just sat there, frozen. All the blood seemed to have drained from her face. This wasn't a mouse. This wasn't the building settling. This was something else. Something impossible. She watched the box, half expecting it to move, to shudder with the effort of whatever was inside. But it remained perfectly still, a dark, unmoving block on her coffee table, leaking this horrible, persistent little sound into her safe space. She timed it. She sat there on her couch, a statue carved from fear, and watched the clock on her phone. The sound continued its steady, maddening rhythm for a full hour, and then, at exactly 3 a.m., it stopped. Not faded out, it just stopped, as if a switch had been flipped. The silence that rushed back in was worse than the noise had been. That was the beginning of the end of her sanity, she said. The next night, it happened again. 2 a.m. on the dot, the scratching started. 3 a.m. on the dot, it stopped. And the night after that. It became a routine. A ritual. Her life, once so ordered and controlled, was now dictated by this obscene appointment. Sleep became a forgotten luxury. She'd doze off in the early evening on the couch, only to be jolted awake by her own anxiety a few minutes before 2. Then she'd endure the hour of scratching and spend the rest of the pre-dawn hours in a state of wired, terrified exhaustion. At work, she was a ghost. Her face was pale and drawn, with dark, bruised-looking circles under her eyes. She stopped talking to people at lunch, just sitting at her desk and staring into space. She told me she was so tired at one point, she fell asleep for a second during a meeting, and was only woken up by her head jerking forward. The box became the center of her universe. An obsession. The fear was still there, but it was now mixed with a white-hot, frustrated anger. The 4th day, she decided she'd had enough. She wasn't going to be its prisoner anymore. She was going to get it open. She took it from the coffee table. It felt heavier now, weighted with significance. She laid an old towel on her kitchen floor and set the box on top. She started with a screwdriver, a big flathead one from her toolkit. She tried to jam the tip into that perfect, hair-thin seam. The metal just skated off the polished wood, not even leaving a mark. She tried harder, putting her weight into it, her knuckles white. The tip of the screwdriver scraped and screeched against the surface, but the seam wouldn't give. Frustration boiled over into rage. She went back to her toolkit and came back with a hammer. She told me she didn't even think. She just lifted it and brought it down on the edge of the box. The sound was all wrong. Instead of a sharp crack of splintering wood, there was just a dull, solid thump. It was like hitting a block of lead. She hit it again, harder. Thump. And again, thump. She was breathing heavily, sweat beading on her forehead, just wailing on this thing on her kitchen floor. After a dozen full-strength blows, she stopped, panting. There were dents in her hammer. The box? There were a few scratches in the dark varnish where the hammer had glanced off, but the wood itself was completely unscathed. Not a crack. Not a splinter. It was physically impossible. It defied all logic. She just knelt there on the floor, staring at it, the hammer limp in her hand. The thing was indestructible. Defeated, she slid down to sit on the cool linoleum, pulling her knees to her chest. She felt like a child. Powerless. She looked at the box. In her rage, she had managed to peel off a corner of the yellowed paper note. Don't open. It felt like it was mocking her now. In her exhausted, desperate state, a new feeling trickled in alongside the fear and anger. A strange, twisted sort of pity. Whatever was in there, it was trapped. It had been trying, methodically, every single night, to get out. For an hour. What kind of creature had that sort of discipline? That sort of desperation? Without thinking, she leaned forward and pressed her ear against the cool, smooth wood of the box. She held her breath and listened. There was nothing. Just silence. Of course there wasn't. It wasn't time yet. She stayed like that for a long time, her ear pressed to the box, as if she could hear its secrets. All she heard was the frantic thumping of her own blood. That night, she was ready for it. She sat on the floor, cross-legged, a few feet from the coffee table. Waiting. 2 a.m. arrived, and with it, the sound. Scritch-scrape. Scritch-scrape. She listened. She closed her eyes and just listened. This time, with the memory of her failed assault fresh in her mind, the sound took on a new quality. It didn't just sound methodical. It sounded pathetic. It was the sound of a hopeless, desperate effort. A small thing, locked in the dark, scraping away at its prison with a single, tiny claw, knowing it would never, ever get out. She felt a wave of nausea. Fear, anger, and now this horrible, misplaced sympathy were churning inside her. She was losing her mind. This thing in a box was driving her insane. She couldn't take it anymore. The constant noise, the lack of sleep, the feeling of being watched in her own home. A sob of pure frustration and exhaustion burst from her throat. She stared at the box, her vision blurring with tears. "What do you want?" she whispered into the quiet room. The sound continued, unabated. "Louder!" she shouted, her voice cracking with hysteria, the words torn from the very depth of her soul. "What do you want?" The scratching stopped. Instantly. The silence that fell was absolute. It was 1,000 times heavier, 1,000 times more terrifying than any of the silences that had come before. It wasn't the silence of absence, it was the silence of listening. It had heard her. It understood. For 3 full seconds the world held its breath. Anna felt the air turn to ice in her lungs. She had made a terrible mistake. Then it started again. But it was different. It was no longer the steady rhythmic scrape. It was a frenzy. A frantic, violent, furious clawing. S-C-R-I-T-C-H, 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 S-C-R-A-P-E-S, C-R-I-T-C-H. It was faster, louder, angrier. It was the sound of something that had been provoked. The sound of something that was no longer just trying to get out. Now it sounded like it was trying to get to her. That night, the frenzy inside the box was something else entirely. She told me it was like a trapped animal that had finally gone rabid. The methodical, almost patient scraping was gone, replaced by a chaotic, splintering rage. It sounded like a nest of hornets made of razors, just tearing the inside of the box to shreds. It was a furious, hateful sound, and the worst part was, she knew she had caused it. She had spoken to it, and it had answered. She backed away from the coffee table, scrambling over the arm of the couch until her back hit the wall. She just sat there on the floor, legs drawn up to her chest, listening to the tiny violent tantrum happening just a few feet away. She didn't cry. She was too scared for that. The fear was a solid object in her throat. The sound was louder now, sharp enough to cut through the hum of the refrigerator. It was undeniably real. And yet, for all its violence, the box itself never moved, not even a millimeter. It was a vessel of pure, contained fury. Then came the biggest mind screw of all. At exactly 3 a.m., just like every other night, the sound stopped cold. It didn't trail off. It just ceased. The switch was flipped. That sudden, profound silence was, in its own way, more terrifying than the noise. The contrast was sickening. It told her that whatever was in there, whatever she had provoked, it was still in control. It was still following its own insane rules. She didn't sleep at all. How could she? She spent the rest of the night wedged between the couch and the wall, watching the first gray, sickly light of dawn creep into her living room, illuminating the dark, silent shape on her coffee table. When it was finally time to get ready for work, moving felt like wading through thick mud. Every part of her screamed to call in sick, to barricade herself inside, but a bigger, more primal fear pushed her out the door. The thought of being in that apartment alone, all day, with that thing, was unbearable. She had to get out. But getting out wasn't an escape anymore. The fear followed her. It started on her walk to the subway station. It was just a feeling at first, a prickle on the back of her neck. You know the one. The one that makes you think someone is looking at you. She'd stop and turn, scanning the sparse morning crowd on the sidewalk. A man in a suit reading his phone. A woman walking her dog. A couple of construction workers drinking coffee. Nobody was looking at her. Nobody seemed out of place. She told herself she was just exhausted, paranoid. Her brain was fried from lack of sleep and was playing tricks on her. Of course that's what it was. She got on the train and found a seat, but the feeling wouldn't go away. She kept glancing at the reflections in the darkened subway window. Her own pale, haunted face stared back, and behind her, the blurred shapes of other passengers. She tried to focus on one single person, to see if their gaze followed her, but it was impossible. The train lurched and swayed, and the reflections morphed and shifted. Still, the feeling remained. It was a quiet, persistent pressure. The feeling of being an exhibit. Of being watched. This continued all day at her desk. She'd feel it, and her head would snap up. But her office was just the same as always. People typing, phones ringing softly, Mr. Henderson walking by with a stack of papers. Nothing. By the end of the day she was a wreck, questioning her own sanity more than ever. That night she threw out the uneaten dinner she'd tried to force down and made the decision. It was over. She couldn't live like this. She was getting rid of the box. She wasn't going to try to open it. She wasn't going to try to understand it. Tomorrow morning, on her way to work, she was going to take it, walk it 10 blocks in the opposite direction and dump it in a random public trash can far away from her neighborhood. Let it be someone else's problem. Or no one's. She didn't care. The thought gave her the first flicker of relief she'd felt in days. The next morning, she woke up on the couch, her neck stiff, after only a couple hours of fitful sleep. The hour of frantic scratching had come and gone as scheduled. She felt numb. She went through the motions, brushing her teeth, pulling on her work clothes. It was time. She walked into the living room, her heart a dull, heavy drum in her chest, and picked up the box. It felt cold, inert. She grabbed her purse and her keys and walked to the front door. She pulled the door open and stopped dead. Her breath hitched. There, on her welcome mat, was a footprint. It wasn't hers. It was large, the shape of a man's work boot, and it was stamped in dark, wet mud. It was perfectly clear, every ridge of the sole imprinted on the cheerful beige fabric of the mat she'd bought at Target. Her blood ran cold. She slowly, fearfully, looked up and down the hallway. It was empty. The patterned institutional carpet was clean. There were no other footprints. There was no trail of mud leading from the stairs or the elevator. There was no mud leading away from her door. There was just this single, isolated, impossible footprint, right there, on her doorstep. Like someone had been lowered from the ceiling, stood there for a moment, and then been lifted away again. She slammed the door shut, her back hitting it hard, and fumbled to throw the deadbolt. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely fit the key into the lock on the doorknob. She locked it, then the second lock, and then slid the chain across. She stood there, panting, her mind reeling. This wasn't a box. A box couldn't leave a footprint. This was a person. A real, solid person had been standing right outside her door. When? Sometime in the night? In the early morning? While she was asleep on the couch just 20 feet away? The thought made her stomach churn with a new kind of terror. The fear of the box was a strange, almost supernatural dread. This was different. This was a raw, primal fear. The fear of an intruder. A stalker. The feeling of being watched wasn't paranoia. It was real. She called in sick to work, her voice a reedy whisper on the phone. She told Mr. Henderson she had a sudden stomach flu. She spent the entire day in her apartment, a prisoner now by her own choice. The box sat on her kitchen counter, temporarily forgotten. The real threat was outside. Or was it? She checked every window lock 3 times. She sat on her couch, facing the door, for hours. She didn't watch TV. She didn't read. She just listened. Every creak of the floorboards in the apartment above, every siren in the distance, every voice in the hallway sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She was a tightly coiled spring of pure fear. As evening fell and the apartment grew dark, her dread intensified. She knew the nightly ritual was coming. The box was sitting there, a silent accomplice to the new human terror. Did they work together? The idea was so insane she almost laughed. A hysterical little bark of a sound. Was she losing her mind? Maybe the footprint was a bizarre coincidence. A delivery guy who stepped in a puddle. It had to be. But deep down, she didn't believe it. She didn't make coffee. She knew she wouldn't be able to sleep anyway. She turned off all the lights except for the small lamp by her bed, leaving the living room and the area by the front door in deep shadow. She sat on her bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, and waited. Her phone screen glowed, 1:58 a.m. Her body tensed, 1:59 a.m. She held her breath, 2 a.m. Right on schedule, the sound started. The furious, hateful scratching from inside the box in her kitchen. Scritch, scratch, scrape, scritch. It seemed even louder tonight, echoing in the silent apartment. She closed her eyes, trying to block it out, but it was useless. It was the soundtrack to her new life. And then she heard it. It was something else. A new sound. It was so quiet she thought at first she was imagining it, that her tired mind was finally cracking. It was a whisper. A low, sibilant murmur, coming from the direction of the front door. Her eyes snapped open. She strained her ears, trying to separate it from the scratching and the frantic pounding of her own heart. There it was again. It was too low to make out any words, but it was unmistakably a human voice. A man's voice, speaking in a soft, continuous monotone. It sounded like someone standing right outside her door, their face close to the wood, having a very quiet phone conversation. The scratching from the kitchen continued its frantic assault, a bizarre counterpoint to the soft, steady whispering at the door. One was a sound of contained, inhuman rage. The other was a sound of calm, human menace. And they were happening at the same time. They were a symphony from hell, composed just for her. She slid out of bed, her feet making no sound on the floor. She moved like a ghost, keeping to the shadows, her body screaming at her to stay put, to hide under the covers like a child. But she had to know. She had to see. The need was a physical ache, stronger than the fear. She crept through her living room, past the dark shape of the coffee table, her eyes fixed on the front door. The whispering grew infinitesimally louder as she got closer. It was right there, just on the other side of that thin piece of wood. She reached the door, pressing her body flat against the wall beside it. Her breath was shallow, silent puffs of air. The whispering was constant, a soft, flowing stream of sound, like water over rocks. She couldn't understand a single word. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, her ear just inches from the source. Who was he talking to? What was he saying? Why here? Why now? Kayubahai, she had to see. Biting her lips so hard she tasted blood, she slowly, so slowly, leaned away from the wall. She reached for the door, her fingers trembling as they touched the cool metal of the peephole cover. She slid it aside without a sound. She took one last, shaky breath and put her eye to the lens. The whispering stopped. Instantly, the silence slammed into her like a physical blow. In the split second it took for her eye to focus on the distorted, fisheye view of the hallway, the sound had vanished. It hadn't faded. It had been cut off, as if the speaker knew, somehow, in that exact moment, that he was being watched. The hallway outside was empty. The overhead lights cast a sterile yellow glow on the patterned carpet. No one was there. There was nothing but a silence so deep, so absolute and knowing, that it was the loudest thing she had ever heard. I backed away from the door so slowly it felt like I was moving through water. One step, then another. My bare feet made no sound on the hardwood floor. It felt wrong to make any noise, like I would be breaking some sacred, awful vow of silence that had just been made between me and whoever was out there. That silence. It was worse than the whispering. Way worse. The whispering was just a sound, but the silence was a message. It was a direct response to my action. It said, I see you. I know you're there. The game just changed. I didn't go back to bed. I couldn't. The bedroom suddenly felt a million miles away. A different country I had no passport for. I ended up back on the couch, sinking into the cushions, pulling my knees up to my chest. I sat there in the dark, my eyes wide open, just staring at the front door. I could still see it in my mind's eye, that distorted, empty hallway. No shadow, no flicker of movement, nothing. Just sterile yellow light on worn-out carpet. It was a clean crime scene. The scratching from the kitchen had continued its manic rhythm the whole time, oblivious. It was just an automated part of the horror now, the background music, but my focus wasn't on the box anymore. The box was just a thing. A weird, impossible thing, but a thing nonetheless. The footprint, the whispering, the sudden, pointed silence. That was a person. A living, breathing, thinking person who was intentionally tormenting me. And that was 1,000 times more terrifying. A haunted object is one thing. You can try to understand its rules. A malicious human being? They have no rules. Or worse, they make up their own. And you're the only other player. My fear was starting to curdle into something else. A hot, simmering rage. Who the hell did this person think they were? To stand outside my home, my sanctuary, and whisper into the wood? To leave their muddy footprint on my welcome mat like they were marking their territory? The sheer audacity of it. The violation made my hands clench into fists. They had taken my safe place and turned it into a stage for their sick little play. Right then, in the pre-dawn darkness with the sound of frantic scratching still filling the air, I made a decision. A real one. It was over. I was done being a part of this. The box was the catalyst. Maybe it wasn't the source of everything, but it was the focal point. It was the thing that had anchored this nightmare to my life. Before the box, my life was boring, maybe, but it was mine. It was safe. This person, this stalker, they were obsessed with the box, or at least they were using it, so getting rid of it felt like the only move I had left on the board. The scratching stopped at exactly 3 a.m. The abrupt silence fell over the apartment like a heavy blanket. This time, I didn't flinch. I just noted it. The end of the performance. I waited a few more minutes, then I moved. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want to. I knew the layout of my apartment by heart, and I preferred the shadows. They felt more honest. I went to the kitchen and stood over the box on the counter. It was just a dark, inert shape. Harmless in the daylight, a monster in the dark. I wasn't going to touch it. Not yet. I went to the closet and pulled out a thick, black drawstring trash bag. The heavy-duty kind. I laid it out on the floor. Tomorrow morning, first thing, I wouldn't even have coffee. I would wake up, put on my shoes, walk over to the box, and without looking at it for a second longer than I had to, I would place it inside this bag. I'd pull the drawstrings tight and tie a double knot. My plan was already forming, a desperate act of self-preservation. I wasn't just going to dump it in the building's trash chute. No, that was too close. This thing needed distance. I would take the bag, walk to the bus stop, and ride the B-42 all the way to the industrial park on the other side of the river. It was a desolate area I only knew from getting lost once, full of warehouses and shipping depots. I'd find some huge, anonymous dumpster behind a factory that probably hadn't been emptied in a month, and I would just toss it in. Let it be buried under a ton of real garbage. Let it rot. Let it become someone else's problem in a part of the city I never, ever had a reason to visit again. Thinking about it, actually having a concrete plan, was the first breath of fresh air I'd had in days. It felt like I was finally doing something, not just reacting. I was taking a piece back. It was a small piece, a tiny sliver of control, but it was something. I was so exhausted, my entire body ached with a fatigue that went bone deep. But this plan gave me a spark. I spent the rest of the morning hours on the couch, dozing in and out of a shallow, dreamless sleep, the black trash bag lying on the floor like a promise. I must have drifted off for real at some point, because I woke up with a stiff neck and the hazy gray light of a miserable, overcast morning filtering through the blinds. I didn't check the time. I didn't care. It was morning, it was time. I sat up, my body feeling heavy and slow. Today was the day. I would endure the fear one last time on the bus, and then it would be done. Freedom. The thought was so powerful it almost made me dizzy. I stood up and stretched, my joints popping. And then I stopped. My phone was on the coffee table where I'd left it. The screen was dark. I hadn't made a single phone call. I hadn't texted anyone about my plan. I hadn't even written it down. The entire strategy, from the black bag to the bus route to the industrial park, had existed only inside my own head. I stared at the phone. For some reason, my gaze was fixed on it. A cold dread, completely different from the earlier fear, began to creep up my spine. It was a slow, sickening trickle of ice water. Why was I so fixated on my phone? As if on cue, the screen lit up. It wasn't a call. It was a notification banner at the top of the screen. A new message. My heart didn't just drop. It ceased to exist. My blood went cold. I could see the preview from where I stood. It didn't show the full message, just the sender. Unknown number. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It felt like the air in the room had solidified around me, pressing in from all sides. My eyes were locked on those two words on the screen. Unknown number. It was him. It had to be him. The man who whispered. The man who left the footprint. He was reaching out. He was breaking the final barrier. The one between the physical world outside my door and the digital world I held in my hand. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely command it to move. It was like watching someone else's arm reach out. I picked up the phone. The metal felt frigid, like it had been sitting in a freezer. My thumb hovered over the notification. Don't open it. Every rational part of my brain screamed, don't look. Just throw the phone against the wall. Smash it. It's tainted. But I couldn't. I had to know. The need to know was a disease. I tapped the screen. The message opened. It was just one sentence. 7 simple words that shattered my world into a million tiny, razor-sharp pieces. Don't throw it away. It will be lonely. I read it once. Then twice. My brain refused to process it. It was like trying to read a foreign language. Don't throw it away. It will be lonely. The phone slipped from my numb fingers. It hit the area rug with a soft, muffled thud, the sound horribly small in the vast, crushing silence of the apartment. I stared down at the glowing screen on the floor. He knew. The thought wasn't a flash of insight. It was a slow, brutal wave of realization that washed over me, drowning me. He knew my plan. Not just that I was getting rid of the box. He knew I was going to throw it away. The specific action. The intention I had formed entirely within the confines of my own skull. How? How could he possibly know? My mind scrambled, trying to find a logical foothold. A bug? Did he plant a microphone in my apartment? When? How? I did a frantic, sweeping glance of the living room, my eyes darting from the smoke detector to the light fixtures to the air vents. Was he listening to me right now? Had he heard me breathing, my heart hammering against my ribs? Had he heard the phone hit the floor? Mako. But a bug didn't explain it. I hadn't spoken my plan out loud. I hadn't whispered it to myself. It was a thought. A silent, internal strategy. A terrifying, impossible conclusion began to bloom in the back of my mind. Dark and poisonous. He hadn't heard me. He was watching me. He was reading me. The way I looked at the black trash bag. The determination in my posture. He had been watching me for so long. From somewhere so close. That he could interpret my every micro-expression, my every silent decision. He wasn't just a stalker. He was a student. And I was his sole all-consuming subject of study. The word lonely echoed in my head. Such a strange, soft, manipulative word. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't aggressive. It was something far more insidious. It was an attempt at creating a bond, a shared secret between me, him, and the object. It implied he cared about the box's feelings. It was insane. It was the language of a deeply, profoundly disturbed mind. I stumbled backwards, my legs weak and uncooperative until my back hit the wall. I slid down to the floor, my gaze still locked on the phone. My mouth was open, a silent scream trapped in my throat. I couldn't make a sound. I looked from the phone on the floor to the box on the kitchen counter. Then I looked at the front door. At the windows. The walls. None of them were barriers anymore. They weren't for protection, they were just the edges of the cage. My apartment wasn't my fortress. It was his observation deck. It was his laboratory. And this entire time, while I thought I was defending myself from something trying to get in, the truth was infinitely worse. He was already in. He was in my schedule, in my space, in my head. And I was the only thing in the fishbowl. My mind was a blank white space. The phone on the floor wasn't a phone anymore. It was an artifact from a different life. A life where things made sense. In this new reality, the one I'd apparently been living in for weeks without knowing it, the laws of physics had been rewritten. Thoughts were no longer private. The inside of my head was just another room for him to peer into. The silence in the apartment was absolute. The city outside, the distant traffic, the hum of the refrigerator, it had all vanished. The only thing that existed was the crushing weight of the air, and the knowledge that I was being watched. Not just watched. Read. How long did I sit there? I don't know. Minutes? An hour? Time had folded in on itself. I was just a statue on the floor, my back pressed hard against the cold drywall. My gaze was fixed on the kitchen counter, on the dark, unassuming shape of the wooden box. The source of it all. And yet, not the source at all. It was a prop. A magic trick to make me look at one hand while the other one was doing something terrible. A new kind of fear began to replace the cold shock. It was hot and sharp. It was the fear of a cornered animal. My safe place was a lie. My locks were a joke. My privacy was an illusion he had allowed me to keep. Stay here, and I would die. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but he wouldn't stop. This game was his entire world, and I was the only other player. He would keep pushing, keep taking little pieces of me, until there was nothing left. And that's what finally got me moving. It wasn't bravery, it was pure primal terror, the instinct to live. I didn't stand up so much as I scrambled, my limbs clumsy and disconnected. It felt like I was learning how to use my body for the first time. I had to get out. Not later, not in the morning. Now, right now. My eyes darted around the room trying to form a plan, but there was no room for plans anymore. He knew plans. This had to be pure reaction. Keys, phone, wallet. My hands moved with a frantic, jerky energy. I snatched my purse from the back of the chair, my fingers fumbling as I shoved my phone inside. I didn't even look at the screen. I didn't want to see if he'd sent another message. My keys were in the little ceramic bowl by the door. I grabbed them, the jingle of the metal sounding obscenely loud in the quiet. My hand was on the doorknob. I was almost there. This was it. A few more seconds, and I'd be in the hallway. I could scream, I could run, I could be free. And then I stopped. My eyes fell on the kitchen counter, on the box. I can't explain what happened next. It wasn't a thought. It was an impulse, a wire that bypassed my brain entirely. I couldn't leave it. I couldn't leave it for him. It felt like leaving a part of my soul behind, a trophy for him to keep. It was a piece of the nightmare, and I had to take it with me. I lurched back to the kitchen, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I grabbed the box. It was cool and smooth under my sweating palms. It felt heavier than it looked, weighted with everything that had happened. I hugged it to my chest like a shield, or maybe like a bomb I had to disarm, and turned back to the door. Okay. I was ready now. Purse on my shoulder, keys in one hand, the godforsaken box clutched in the other. It was clumsy, but I didn't care. My right hand, shaking violently, worked on the locks. First, the deadbolt. It made a loud, grating thunk as it retracted. The sound was a gunshot in the silence. My heart hammered against my ribs. A frantic drumbeat. Please don't let him be outside. Please, please, please. Next, the chain. My fingers were slick with sweat, and I fumbled with it, the metal link scraping against the plate. It took 2 tries before it came loose. Finally, the doorknob. The last one. I twisted it. The latch clicked back. Freedom was an inch away. I pulled the door inward. Just a crack. The stale yellow light of the hallway spilled onto my floor. I was halfway there, and then I heard it. Scratch. 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 It was loud. Close. And wrong. I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. The door opened just enough to see a slice of the empty hallway carpet. The sound was frantic, desperate, the same rhythm I had memorized over countless sleepless nights. The sound that always started at 2 in the morning. My blood turned to ice water. My mind raced. No. It couldn't be. Not now. My eyes shot down to the box clutched against my chest. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening, my body rigid with disbelief. Nothing. The box was silent. It was inert. Just a piece of wood. The frantic scratching continued, echoing in the small space of my entryway. It was louder than it had ever been, sharper, more defined. It was the sound of ragged fingernails tearing at wood, a dry, scraping, horrifying sound. If it wasn't coming from the box, then where? My movements were slow, robotic. It was like moving through thick mud. I let go of the doorknob, letting the door swing slightly ajar. I turned my head, following the sound. It was coming from my right. From against the wall, right next to the front door. From the closet. I stared at the plain, white-painted door of the coat closet. A place for jackets, an old vacuum cleaner, a pair of rain boots. It had been there since the day I moved in. A piece of furniture. A fact. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound was coming from inside. My mouth fell open, but no sound came out. It was impossible. My brain refused to process it. It was like being told the sky was green. I knew what I was hearing, but I couldn't accept it. The box was the source. It had always been the box. The whole nightmare was built on that one. Simple fact. To have that fact ripped away at this exact moment felt like the floor had disintegrated beneath my feet. The box was never the source. It was a speaker. A decoy. A distraction. The sound had always been coming from somewhere else. Somewhere close. And as I stood there, paralyzed by this new, world-shattering truth, another sound joined the scratching. A low, soft creak. It was the closet door. It hadn't been closed all the way. Or maybe the latch wasn't fully engaged. It was moving. Opening. Slowly. Millimeter by millimeter, a dark, vertical line appeared and began to widen. It opened without a sound, at first. A silent, black wound splitting the white door. Then it groaned, a low wooden protest as it swung further inward. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. It felt like my whole body was turning to stone, that my very blood was hardening in my veins. This was a kind of fear beyond anything I had ever imagined. This was the fear of seeing the monster, not just hearing it. The scratching stopped. The closet door was now open about a foot. The inside was a pit of absolute darkness. I couldn't see anything at first. And then, a shape resolved itself from the shadows. It was a person. A dark mass was hunched over in the impossibly small space, crammed in between my winter coat and the wall. It was a large frame, folded up like a piece of grotesque origami. As I watched, petrified, the shape began to move. It wasn't a sudden movement. It was a slow, deliberate unfolding. A knee shifted. A shoulder rolled forward. A head, shrouded in darkness, lifted slowly. It was the movement of someone who had been in a cramped position for a very, very long time and was finally stretching out. The shape was getting bigger, taller, filling the dark space of the closet as it began to lever itself out. It was coming out. Right here. 3 feet in front of me. The man who whispered, the man who texted, the man who had been living inside my closet. He was right there. For a second that stretched into a cold eternity, my brain just stopped working. It was like a computer that had been given an impossible command. The image in front of me, the man unfolding himself out of my coat closet, did not fit into any known category of reality. It was a glitch in the universe, happening 3 feet from my face. My body was locked, every muscle was screaming to run, but the signal wasn't getting through. All I could do was stare at the dark shape that was quickly becoming a man, a very large man in the narrow confines of my entryway. And then, something snapped. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a plan. It was something deeper, something ancient, a circuit that bypassed all the frozen, terrified parts of my mind and went straight to my arm. The wooden box was still clutched to my chest, a dead weight of slick, polished wood. My arm, acting on its own, swung back and then launched forward. I threw it with every ounce of panic strength I had. The box flew through the air, end over end, a dark blur against the white wall. It didn't hit him squarely. He was still moving, still unfurling, and he flinched instinctively, turning his head. The box caught him on the shoulder with a dull, hollow thud. It wasn't a sound of damage or pain, it was just the sound of wood hitting fabric and flesh. But it was enough. It was a break in his script. A moment of surprise, and that was all I needed. The connection between my brain and my legs was suddenly restored. I didn't turn and run. I practically fell out of my own apartment. My left shoulder slammed into the door frame, sending a jolt of pain up my neck, but I didn't feel it. I was in the hallway. The stale, yellow-lit hallway was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen. And then I started screaming. It wasn't a scream for help. It wasn't directed at anyone. It was just a raw, animal sound tearing its way out of my throat, the release of every bit of terror I'd been holding in for weeks. I ran, my purse bouncing wildly against my hip, my feet in their flimsy house slippers barely gripping the worn carpet. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The only thought in my head was down, down, down. The stairwell door was heavy, but I threw my whole body against it and stumbled through. The concrete steps echoed with my panicked footsteps and my own continuous, ragged screaming. I took the stairs 2-3 at a time, one hand sliding clumsily along the cold metal railing, my balance precarious. I fully expected to feel a hand grab the back of my neck at any second. I could almost imagine the feeling of his fingers closing around my hair. The thought propelled me forward, faster, more recklessly. As I rounded the landing between the 3rd and 2nd floor, a door swung open just ahead of me. A man, probably in his 50s with graying hair and a panicked look on his face, stood there in a bathrobe. He was holding a phone. My screaming probably devolved into incoherent sobbing at that point. I don't really remember. I just remember seeing him. A real person, an anchor in the storm of my madness. I stumbled to a halt in front of his open door, my chest heaving, trying to gasp for air between sobs. Hey, what's wrong? What's going on? He asked, his voice a mixture of alarm and concern. I couldn't form words. I just pointed a shaking finger back up the stairs. Upstairs, my apartment, closet. That was all he needed. He didn't ask any more questions. He reached out, grabbed my arm firmly and pulled me inside his apartment. The sound of his deadbolt clicking into place was the loudest, most comforting sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of safety. I collapsed against his door, sliding down to the floor, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. He was already talking into his phone. Yes, I need police. My upstairs neighbor, an intruder I think. Apartment 3B. She's here with me. She's hysterical. The next hour was a blur of disconnected moments. I remember sitting on my neighbor's couch, wrapped in a scratchy wool blanket he'd given me. His name was Mr. Henderson. He gave me a glass of water, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I just sat there, staring at the wall, while he spoke to the 911 operator. The sounds of sirens grew from a distant wail to a deafening roar just outside the building. Then, heavy footsteps pounding up the stairs, voices in the hall, loud and authoritative. Ma'am? I'm Officer Brady. Can you tell us what happened? I tried. I really did. I told them about the box, the scratching, the text message. I told them about the closet. I felt insane saying it all out loud. It sounded like a bad horror movie plot. I watched the two officers exchange a look. It wasn't a look of disbelief, exactly. It was more like a weary, "we've got a weird one tonight" kind of look. One of them, a younger woman named Officer Chen, stayed with me and Mr. Henderson while Officer Brady and two others went up to my apartment. I sat on that couch, listening to the muffled sounds from upstairs. The squeak of my own front door opening. Voices. Footsteps moving around in my home. It was an out-of-body experience. My safe space, my little sanctuary, was now a crime scene. After what felt like a lifetime, Officer Brady came back down. He looked somber. "Ma'am, the apartment is clear. Whoever was in there is gone." A wave of something that wasn't quite relief washed over me. He was gone. But he had been there. I wasn't crazy. "We found this on the floor in the entryway," Officer Brady said, and he held up the wooden box. It looked so ordinary in the light of day. He turned it over in his gloved hands. "You said you couldn't get it open?" "I tried," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Hammers, screwdrivers, nothing." He looked at me, then at the box. With his thumb, he simply pushed up on the lid. It popped open with a faint click. I stared. It was so anticlimactic it felt like a punchline to a cruel joke. He had opened it. Just like that. He tipped the contents into his gloved hand. There was no creature, no monster, no source of the scratching. Inside was a small, black Bluetooth speaker, the kind you might clip to a backpack. Next to it was a flat, rectangular battery pack and a small, simple circuit board with a tiny antenna. "It's a receiver," Officer Brady said, his voice flat. He was playing the sound remotely, from somewhere nearby. The pieces clicked into place with a nauseating certainty. The box was never locked. It was just a box. The scratching was a recording. The text message. He had to have my number, had to be close enough to see I was about to throw it away. The whole thing was a performance. A sick, elaborate game to mess with my head. I felt hollow. It was all a lie. A terrifying, manipulative lie. "We need you to come upstairs, ma'am," Officer Chen said gently. "There's something else you need to see. Or, rather, something we need to ask you about." Walking back into my apartment was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Everything looked the same but felt tainted, violated. The police were everywhere. They were dusting for prints. My eyes were immediately drawn to the closet. The door was wide open. Officer Brady led me to it. "Did you ever notice anything strange about the back of this closet?" I shook my head numbly. It was just a closet. I stored my vacuum and a few winter coats in there. He pointed. Another officer had removed my coats. The back wall of the closet wasn't drywall. It was a thin piece of particle board, painted white to match the rest. And at the bottom, near the floor, there were faint scuff marks. The officer grabbed the edge of the board and pulled. It came away from the wall with a soft scraping sound. It wasn't even nailed in. Behind it was not the solid wall I expected. There was a hole. It wasn't a big hole, maybe 1.5 feet wide, cut crudely through the insulation and the real drywall that separated my apartment from the one next door. Apartment 3A. The one that had been vacant for almost a year. My blood ran cold. The scratching, it hadn't been coming from the closet. It had been coming from through the closet. From next door. He wasn't just hiding in there tonight. He had a doorway. "We've cleared the adjoining unit," Officer Brady said, his voice low and serious. "He is not there. But we found where he was living." I didn't go in. I couldn't. But Officer Chen described it to me later, while I was giving my official statement, her own voice, tight with disgust. There was a filthy mattress on the floor right up against the shared wall. Empty cans of soup and stale cracker boxes were piled in a corner. And on the wall facing the hole into my closet, were the pictures. Dozens of them. They were photos of me. Not photos of me on the street, or at work. Photos of me inside my apartment. Me on the couch, watching a movie. My face illuminated by the glow of the TV. Me in the kitchen, cooking dinner, humming to myself. Me sleeping. My face slack and vulnerable. There was even one of me crying on the phone with my mom a few weeks ago after a bad day at work. I started to feel dizzy. Officer Chen had to get me a chair. He had been watching me for months. Long before I ever found that stupid box. He had been living next to me, separated by a single layer of drywall, observing every mundane, private moment of my life through that hole. He knew my schedule. He knew my habits. He knew my fears. The box wasn't the beginning of the nightmare. It wasn't even the middle. It was the grand finale. The last act of a sick, twisted play that he had written, directed, and produced, all for an audience of one. Himself. The box was just his way of finally stepping onto the stage. I never went back to that apartment. I broke my lease the next day. I stayed with my parents for a month, too terrified to be alone. The police never found him. He vanished as completely as he had appeared. A ghost who lived in the walls. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about it. I don't think about the man in the closet as much anymore. What I think about is the pictures. The thought of his eyes on me, day after day, when I thought I was safe and alone in my own home. That's a different kind of violation. It's a theft of something you can never get back. He didn't just break into my apartment. He broke into my life, into my sense of security, and he stole it all. Officer Chen told me one last thing that has stayed with me ever since. Among the pictures on his wall, there was one that was perfectly centered, larger than all the others. It was a photo of me, that rainy afternoon, bending down to pick up a small, intricately carved wooden box next to a public trash can. He hadn't just left the box there by chance. He had been there, watching me find it, his game already in motion. He was just waiting for me to take the bait.